A busy Saturday in Birmingham. The grocery store in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, was alive with energy on a bustling Saturday afternoon. Shoppers hurriedly maneuvered through the aisles, some with carts filled to the brim and others with just a basket of essentials. Kids begged for snacks in the candy aisle, carts squeaked as they turned corners, and the faint hum of grocery store announcements provided a steady backdrop to the scene. Maya Brooks, a 17-year-old high school senior, stood at her register, patiently scanning items and greeting customers with a warm smile. Despite the endless monotony of her job, Maya approached each customer with kindness and professionalism, even when it wasn't reciprocated. Her honey-brown skin glowed under the fluorescent lights, and her neat braids were tied back into a ponytail, giving her a composed yet approachable appearance. Balancing her part-time job with school and her responsibilities at home, Maya had grown used to hard work. Her mom, a single parent, had always told her, "Dignity doesn't come from what you do, but how you do it." Maya lived by those words, finding pride in her ability to handle any situation with grace. That day, Maya's register had been busy non-stop. She scanned items, bagged groceries, and exchanged polite conversation with customers as the line behind her grew. A regular customer handed her exact change, praising her efficiency, and Maya flashed her signature smile. "Thank you for shopping with us," she said warmly. As that customer exited, Maya glanced at the next person in line. There, standing with a cart full of groceries, was Carol Higgins, a woman well known among the staff. Carol was in her early 60s, with sharp eyes, a tightly pursed mouth, and an air of entitlement that preceded her. She was infamous for her impatience and her knack for finding fault with even the smallest details. To the staff, she was the type of customer everyone dreaded but dealt with anyway. Maya braced herself. Carol approached the register, slamming a loaf of bread onto the conveyor belt as though she were staging a protest. Her movements were exaggerated, and her discontent was palpable. She huffed loudly, her lips curling in annoyance as her eyes darted between the line of customers and Maya's calm demeanor. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Maya greeted, her tone as warm as ever. "Did you find everything you needed today?" Carol didn't respond. Instead, she rolled her eyes and started unloading her cart with dramatic force. Each item hit the conveyor belt with a loud thud. A carton of eggs nearly toppled over from the impact, but Maya quickly caught it before disaster struck. "Can you hurry it up?" Carol snapped, her voice loud enough to attract attention from nearby customers. "Some of us have better things to do than stand here all day." Maya kept her composure, smiling faintly as she scanned a carton of milk. "I'll do my best, ma'am," she replied politely. Carol scoffed. "Your best? That's not saying much. You people are always so slow." The words cut through Maya like a knife. "You people." She froze for a brief moment, her fingers pausing over the scanner. Her chest tightened, but she took a deep breath, refusing to let the comment break her professionalism. She continued scanning, moving efficiently despite the growing knot in her stomach. Her co-workers noticed the exchange from their nearby registers but remained quiet, their eyes darting between Maya and Carol. Maya had dealt with difficult customers before, but there was something particularly venomous in Carol's tone, something that made the air around them feel heavier. As Maya totaled up the groceries, she said softly, "Your total comes to $587, ma'am." Carol dug into her oversized purse, pulling out a worn leather wallet. As she handed over the cash, she hesitated, narrowing her eyes at Maya. The disdain in her expression was unmistakable. "You know," Carol said loudly, her voice dripping with condescension, "I just don't understand why they hire people like you. No work ethic, no manners. It's embarrassing." Maya's hand trembled slightly as she took the money, her knuckles brushing against Carol's in the process. Carol immediately recoiled, as though the touch had offended her. Maya's heart pounded, her mind racing with 1,000 things she wanted to say, but her mother's voice echoed in her head, "Stay professional. Never stoop to their level." Keeping her tone steady, Maya handed Carol her change and receipt. "Thank you for shopping with us, ma'am. Have a nice day." But Carol wasn't done. "Oh, don't act like you care," Carol sneered, stepping closer to the counter. "You're probably only here because you need a handout. I see right through you." Maya felt the tears sting the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She stood still, gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself. Around her, the once busy store seemed to have gone quiet. Other customers and employees were now openly watching the interaction, their faces reflecting a mix of discomfort and anger. Before Maya could respond, a voice from the line interrupted. "Excuse me." The voice was calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. It belonged to a young man in his late 20s, dressed in a sharp suit that contrasted with the casual attire of most shoppers. His confident posture and piercing gaze commanded attention as he stepped forward, placing his basket on the counter. Carol turned toward him, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion. "Can I help you?" she snapped. The man, whose name was Eric, met Carol's glare with unwavering composure. "Yes, you can," he said. "By showing this young lady some respect." The air in the store grew even quieter. All eyes were on Eric as he addressed Carol, his voice steady but powerful. "You don't talk to people like that," Eric continued. "Especially not someone who's just doing their job and trying to help you." Carol's face flushed red, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response. "I don't see how this is any of your business," she said finally, her voice faltering. "It became my business the moment you decided it was okay to humiliate someone in public," Eric replied. "You don't know her story. You don't know what she's been through, how hard she works, or what she's accomplished. But you assume the worst because it's easier for you than being decent." Maya's chest tightened as she listened, her eyes darting between Eric and Carol. She had never seen anyone stand up for her so openly. Eric stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound even more intimidating. "You should apologize," he said. Carol blinked, her confidence visibly shaken. "Apologize?" she sputtered. "For what?" "For treating her like she's less than you," Eric replied, his tone resolute. "And for assuming she deserves anything less than respect." Around them, customers and employees alike stood frozen, their gazes locked on the unfolding scene. Carol, now visibly flustered, glanced around, realizing that everyone was watching her. For the first time, she seemed to feel the weight of her actions. But Carol wasn't ready to surrender. "I don't owe anyone an apology," she muttered, though her voice lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. Eric's expression softened, but his resolve remained. "You may not think you do," he said. "But sometimes, the most humbling lessons come from unexpected places." Carol's hands trembled as she clutched her purse. She glanced at Maya, who stood silently, her composure intact despite the storm she had just endured. And for the first time, Carol felt something she hadn't expected: shame. The lesson begins. The tension in the grocery store was palpable, heavy like a storm cloud that had rolled in out of nowhere. Carol Higgins, who had spent decades wielding her entitlement as a weapon, suddenly found herself at the center of an unwelcome spotlight. Every eye in the store was on her, and the once confident sneer on her face was starting to falter under the weight of Eric's words. Maya Brooks, the young cashier who had been the target of Carol's venom, stood silently at her register. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, but her face betrayed none of the hurt that simmered beneath the surface. She had learned long ago how to keep her emotions in check in moments like these. But this time was different. This time, someone had stepped forward. Eric remained calm, his posture steady and his tone unwavering. He had caught everyone's attention, not with a raised voice or theatrics, but with the sheer force of his conviction. His words hung in the air, demanding acknowledgement. "You don't owe anyone an apology," Eric repeated, his gaze fixed on Carol. "Let me ask you something. what gives you the right to speak to anyone the way you just did? Carol's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For once, the quick retorts she usually relied on seemed to have deserted her. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the growing crowd of onlookers. Eric didn't wait for an answer. Is it her age? Her job? Her skin color? What exactly makes you feel so superior? A murmur rippled through the crowd as customers exchanged glances. Carol's face grew redder by the second, and her hands clutched her purse tightly, as though it might anchor her in the storm she had unwittingly created. Maya tried to focus on her breathing, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. She didn't want to cry, not here, not now. But something about Eric's presence, his willingness to stand up for her, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't expected. Carol finally found her voice, though it was shaky and defensive. I don't need a lecture from you, she snapped. You don't know me, and you certainly don't know my intentions. Eric raised an eyebrow, a faint, almost amused smile crossing his lips. You're right, I don't know you. But I know enough. I know that your actions speak louder than any excuse you could possibly come up with. And right now, your actions are telling everyone here exactly who you are. Carol's gaze darted around the room, seeking an ally among the onlookers, but no one stepped forward. Instead, the crowd seemed to close ranks around Eric and Maya, their silence a collective condemnation of Carol's behavior. Eric turned his attention to Maya, his expression softening. Are you okay? He asked gently. Maya nodded, though her voice was barely a whisper. I'm fine. Thank you. Eric's jaw tightened slightly, and he looked back at Carol. Do you see her? He asked, his voice low but powerful. I mean really see her? Or is she just another face to you, another person you can dismiss without a second thought? Carol bristled, the defensive wall she had built around herself beginning to crack. I don't need to stand here and be humiliated, she said, her voice rising slightly as she grabbed her cart. I've done nothing wrong. Eric stepped aside, his movements deliberate and calm. If you really believe that, then go ahead. Walk out of here. But know this, you'll leave with the same bitterness you came in with, and nothing will change. Carol froze, her hands gripping the handle of her cart. There was something in Eric's voice, something unyielding yet compassionate, that stopped her in her tracks. She looked at him, then at Maya, and for a moment, her resolve wavered. Meanwhile, Maya's co-workers had gathered at the edges of the scene, their faces a mix of shock and admiration. One of them, an older cashier named Evelyn, stepped closer to Maya and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're handling this like a pro, Evelyn whispered. Don't let her get to you. Maya offered a small smile, grateful for the support. She wanted to believe that this moment would pass, that the sting of Carol's words would fade, but the weight of the encounter still sat heavy in her chest. As if sensing the tension, Eric turned to Maya once more. You didn't deserve any of this, he said firmly. None of it. His words, though simple, felt like a balm to Maya's frayed nerves. For the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed herself to breathe a little easier. Carol, on the other hand, was unraveling. The usual tools in her arsenal, sarcasm, indignation, and self-righteousness, were failing her. She looked around, desperate to regain control of the situation, but the crowd's silent judgment was impossible to ignore. Finally, she let out a frustrated sigh. Fine, she muttered. I'm sorry, okay? There. Are you happy now? The apology, if it could even be called that, was hollow and perfunctory. It landed in the air with a thud, doing little to mend the damage she had caused. Eric shook his head. That's not an apology, he said calmly. An apology is more than just words. It's an acknowledgement of what you've done and a commitment to do better. What you just said. That's just noise. Carol's eyes widened, her face flushing with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She had never been challenged like this before, and she didn't know how to handle it. But before she could respond, a voice from the back of the crowd broke through the tension. "Mom." The crowd parted slightly, revealing a young man in his late teens. He had Carol's sharp eyes but none of her arrogance. He looked at her with a mix of confusion and disappointment, his expression cutting through her defenses like nothing else could. "Ryan?" Carol stammered, her voice faltering. "What are you doing here?" "I was grabbing a few things for Grandma," Ryan said, holding up a small basket. "But then I saw this." His gaze shifted to Maya, then to Eric, and finally back to his mother. "Is this really how you treat people?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Is this who you are?" Carol opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, she looked truly shaken. The judgment of strangers was one thing, but the disappointment in her son's eyes was something she hadn't prepared for. "Ryan, she began, but he cut her off. "No," he said, his voice steady. "Don't explain it to me. Explain it to her." He gestured toward Maya, his expression unyielding. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Carol's composure crumbled. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, might try to justify her actions, but the weight of Ryan's words, and the truth behind them, was too much to deny. Slowly, she turned to Maya. Her lips trembled as she struggled to find the right words. I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was out of line." Maya blinked, her surprise evident. She hadn't expected an apology, least of all from Carol. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. Eric watched the exchange, a faint smile of satisfaction on his face. He stepped back, allowing the moment to unfold without further interruption. And as the crowd began to disperse, the tension in the air gave way to something quieter, something softer. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Confronting the past. The silence in the store was almost deafening as Carol's mumbled apology hung in the air. The tension that had gripped the room began to ease, but the weight of the moment lingered. Maya stood at her register, her heart racing but her face composed. She wanted to believe Carol's apology was sincere, but it felt forced, like it was more for show than a genuine act of remorse. Ryan, Carol's son, was still standing nearby, his basket of groceries forgotten in his hands. His sharp, disappointed gaze lingered on his mother, and the air between them was thick with unspoken emotions. Carol glanced at him nervously, her usual air of entitlement shaken. "Ryan, let's just go," Carol muttered, reaching for her cart. But Ryan didn't move. Instead, he turned to Maya, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Maya hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to being asked how she felt, especially not in moments like this. "I'm fine," she said quietly, though her voice betrayed a hint of exhaustion. Ryan nodded, then turned back to his mother. "You owe her more than that," he said firmly. "A real apology, Mom. Not whatever that was." Carol's face flushed with embarrassment. "Ryan, I already apologized," she snapped, her voice low but tense. "I don't see why you're making such a big deal out of this." "Because it is a big deal," Ryan shot back. "You can't just treat people like that and expect to walk away like nothing happened." Carol's jaw tightened, and for a moment, she looked like she might argue. But something in Ryan's expression stopped her. It wasn't just disappointment, it was hurt. And that hurt cut deeper than any criticism from a stranger ever could. Meanwhile, the other shoppers began to resume their business, though many cast lingering glances at the unfolding scene. Eric, the sharp-suited man who had stepped in earlier, stood quietly to the side, watching with a thoughtful expression. He didn't say anything, but his presence was a steady reminder of the lesson Carol was being forced to confront. Maya, still at her register, shifted uncomfortably. She didn't want to be the center of attention any longer, but she also didn't want to let this moment pass without standing up for herself. Gathering her courage, she looked directly at Carol. "Ma'am," Maya began, her voice steady but firm. "I appreciate your apology, but words only mean so much. Respect isn't something you just say, it's something you show." Carol blinked, clearly caught off guard. For a moment, she seemed unsure how to respond, but Maya wasn't finished. "I've worked here for almost a year," Maya continued, her tone calm but resolute. "I deal with all kinds of customers, some kind, some impatient and some downright rude. But what you said to me today wasn't just rude. It was hurtful. And it wasn't about me doing my job. It was about something bigger than that." Carol's face turned red, her discomfort evident. She looked down at the floor, avoiding Maya's gaze. "I know you might not think it matters," Maya said, her voice softening slightly. "But it does. The way you treat people matters. It matters more than you realize." For a moment, there was silence. Then Ryan stepped forward, his voice calm but insistent. "She's right, Mom. And you know it." Carol let out a shaky breath, her hands gripping the handle of her cart so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked around the store, her eyes darting to the other customers who were still watching her with thinly veiled judgment. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt in years. Finally, she looked at Maya, her expression softening ever so slightly. "I'm sorry," she said again, but this time, her voice was quieter, more sincere. "I shouldn't have spoken to you that way. It was wrong." Maya nodded, her posture relaxing just a little. "Thank you," she said simply. Eric, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "It's a start," he said, his tone measured. "But apologies are only the beginning. Change comes from what you do next." Carol glanced at him, her expression a mix of irritation and begrudging acknowledgement. She didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. As Carol and Ryan began to leave, Ryan paused by Maya's register. He set down his basket and gave her a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said. "And, thank you for being patient. More patient than most people would have been." Maya smiled back, though it was a little hesitant. "Thank you," she said softly. Ryan nodded, then glanced back at his mother, who was waiting near the exit. "I'll make sure she remembers this," he said quietly, almost to himself. As Ryan walked away, Maya felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and a faint glimmer of hope. She didn't know if Carol would truly change, but for the first time, it felt like the possibility was there. Later that evening, as the store began to wind down, Evelyn, the older cashier, approached Maya at her register. "You handled that beautifully," Evelyn said, her voice warm with pride. "I don't know many people who could have stayed as calm as you did." Maya shrugged, though her cheeks flushed with gratitude. "I just did what I thought was right," she said. Evelyn smiled. "Sometimes, doing what's right is the hardest thing of all. But you did it. And I think you made a bigger impact than you realize." Maya nodded, her thoughts drifting back to the confrontation. She didn't know if she'd made a lasting impression on Carol, but she hoped, at the very least, that Ryan would carry the lesson forward. As she closed out her register for the night, Maya couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. She had faced adversity and come out the other side with her dignity intact. And in that moment, she realized something important: respect wasn't something you demanded, it was something you earned. And today, she had earned it. The ripple effect. The incident at the grocery store, though seemingly a brief encounter, had set off ripples that would extend far beyond the walls of the small Birmingham supermarket. Carol Higgins left the store that day quieter than she had been in years. Her usual air of superiority had been stripped away, replaced by something she couldn't quite name, something that felt uncomfortably close to shame. Ryan walked beside her in silence, his disappointment hanging in the air like a tangible weight. As they loaded the groceries into the trunk of their car, Carol tried to muster the courage to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Ryan's face was a reflection of the emotions he rarely shared: frustration, sadness, and a tinge of hope that his mother might finally be willing to confront the truth. "Mom," Ryan said finally, his voice steady but soft. "Do you realize how much your words hurt people?" Carol hesitated, her hands lingering on the edge of the trunk. "I didn't mean to hurt her," she said defensively, though her tone lacked the bite it usually carried. Ryan shook his head, his disappointment deepening. "That's not the point. Intentions don't erase impact. You judged her, humiliated her, and for what? Because she wasn't fast enough for you? Because she didn't meet some ridiculous standard you set in your head?" Carol looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the handle of the cart. She wanted to argue, to justify her actions, but deep down, she knew Ryan was right. She had let her frustration, her biases, and her sense of entitlement get the better of her. And Maya had borne the brunt of it. I guess I didn't think about it that way," Carol admitted reluctantly. Ryan sighed, his expression softening just a little. "It's not just about what you said to her, Mom. It's about what it says about you. Is that really the kind of person you want to be?" Carol didn't respond, but the question lingered in her mind long after they drove away. Meanwhile, back at the grocery store, Maya finished her shift and began tidying up her register. The day had been long, and the encounter with Carol had drained her more than she wanted to admit. But as she gathered her belongings and prepared to leave, she found herself replaying Eric and Ryan's words in her mind. Their support had been unexpected but deeply appreciated. For the first time, she felt like someone had truly seen her, not just as a cashier, but as a person deserving of respect and dignity. Evelyn, the older cashier, approached her as she was leaving. "You did good today, Maya," she said with a warm smile. "You held your ground, and you showed grace under pressure. That's not easy to do." Maya nodded, her lips curving into a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Evelyn. It means a lot coming from you." As Maya walked home that evening, the cool breeze brushing against her skin, she thought about her mother's advice: dignity doesn't come from what you do, but how you do it. Those words had carried her through countless challenges, but today they felt more meaningful than ever. She had faced one of her toughest moments and had come out stronger. That same evening, Ryan sat in his room, replaying the scene from the grocery store in his mind. He couldn't shake the look on Maya's face, the quiet strength she had shown in the face of his mother's cruelty. It stuck with him, not just because it was wrong, but because it reminded him of the lessons his grandmother had taught him growing up. Ryan's grandmother, Carol's mother, had been a strong, compassionate woman who believed in treating everyone with kindness, regardless of their background. She had taught Ryan the value of humility and empathy, lessons that had shaped him into the man he was today. But somewhere along the way, those lessons seemed to have bypassed his mother. Ryan decided to call his grandmother that night. As the phone rang, he thought about how she would react to the story. She answered on the third ring, her warm, familiar voice instantly calming him. "Ryan, sweetheart. How are you?" she asked. "I'm okay, Grandma," Ryan replied, his tone steady. "But I wanted to talk to you about something that happened today." As Ryan recounted the incident, his grandmother listened intently, her silence filled with understanding. When he finished, she sighed softly. "Your mother's always had a hard time seeing past herself," she said gently. "But that doesn't mean she's beyond change." "I just don't know how to get through to her," Ryan admitted. She apologized, but it didn't feel real. "I want her to understand, not just go through the motions." His grandmother paused, her voice thoughtful when she finally spoke. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Ryan. But sometimes, it starts with a moment like this, one that forces you to look in the mirror and see yourself clearly. Give her time, but don't stop holding her accountable. And remind her of who she was raised to be." Ryan nodded, her words settling in his heart. Thanks, Grandma. I'll try. The next morning, Carol woke up feeling uneasy. The memory of the confrontation lingered in her mind, playing on a loop she couldn't escape. She thought about Maya's quiet dignity, about Eric's unwavering conviction, and most of all, about Ryan's disappointment. It gnawed at her, forcing her to confront parts of herself she had long ignored. She spent the day in reflection, replaying not just the incident at the grocery store but countless other moments where her entitlement and impatience had gotten the better of her. She thought about the way she had treated waitstaff, retail workers, and even her own neighbors. The pattern was undeniable, and for the first time, Carol felt the full weight of her actions. By the afternoon, she made a decision. She needed to do more than just apologize, she needed to make amends. That evening, Maya was finishing another shift at the grocery store when she noticed a familiar figure approaching her register. It was Carol, her posture less rigid, her expression softer than before. Maya's heart skipped a beat, unsure of what to expect. "Hello," Carol said quietly, her voice lacking its usual edge. "Hi," Maya replied, her tone cautious but polite. Carol took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she placed a small bouquet of flowers on the counter. "These are for you," she said, her voice breaking just a little. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. The way I treated you was wrong, and there's no excuse for it." Maya stared at the flowers, her surprise evident. She looked up at Carol, searching her face for sincerity, and what she saw was a vulnerability she hadn't expected. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened," Carol continued. "And I realized that I've been carrying around a lot of anger and judgment, at people, at the world, at myself. But that's not your burden to bear. You deserve better than that." Maya's chest tightened as she listened, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She reached out and took the flowers, her hands steady despite the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate that." Carol nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm going to do better," she said. "I promise." As Carol turned to leave, Maya watched her go, the bouquet clutched tightly in her hands. For the first time, it felt like the apology wasn't just words, it was a step towards something better. And as Maya finished her shift that night, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for people like Carol. Maybe, just maybe, change was possible. A bridge rebuilt. The days following Carol's heartfelt apology marked the beginning of a transformation, not just for Carol but for everyone touched by the incident at the grocery store. The ripples of what had happened continued to spread, impacting lives in unexpected ways. For Maya, life went on as usual at the store. The steady hum of customers coming and going gave her little time to dwell on what had happened. Yet, every time she glanced at the bouquet of flowers Carol had given her, sitting in a vase on her kitchen table, she felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, surprise, and a cautious sense of hope. She wanted to believe Carol's apology was genuine, but part of her still doubted whether the change would last. Meanwhile, Carol was wrestling with the weight of her own actions. She couldn't shake the memory of Maya's calm strength, of Eric's pointed words, and most of all, of the disappointment etched on Ryan's face. For years, Carol had built a protective wall around herself, using entitlement and arrogance to shield her from vulnerability. But now, that wall was beginning to crumble. Ryan had been distant since the incident, his usual warmth replaced with a quiet disapproval that stung more than Carol wanted to admit. She had tried to bridge the gap by making small gestures, cooking his favorite meals, asking about his day, but Ryan's responses were short and polite, lacking the easy camaraderie they once shared. One evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Carol couldn't take the silence anymore. "Ryan," she began hesitantly, "I know you're still upset with me. And you have every right to be." Ryan looked up from his plate, his expression guarded. "It's not about being upset, Mom," he said quietly. It's about wanting to see you be better. Carol swallowed hard, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I'm trying, she said. I really am. I don't know where to start. Ryan sighed, setting down his fork. Start by listening, he said simply. To other people, to yourself, to the things you've been ignoring for too long. You don't have to have all the answers, you just have to care enough to look for them. His words lingered in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Carol felt the sting of truth piercing through her defenses. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll try. The next day, Carol decided to put Ryan's advice into action. She returned to the grocery store, this time without the weight of her entitlement or the need to rush through her errands. She wasn't there for groceries, she was there to observe, to listen, and to begin the process of rebuilding the bridges she had burned. She stood near the entrance, watching the employees as they worked. She saw Evelyn, the older cashier, chatting warmly with a regular customer. She saw the stock boys moving quickly to restock shelves. And then she saw Maya, her hands deftly scanning items at the register, her face calm and composed despite the steady stream of customers. Carol approached Maya's register cautiously, waiting until the line had dwindled. When it was finally her turn, Maya looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. Good afternoon, Maya, Carol said softly, her voice lacking its usual edge. Good afternoon, Maya replied, her tone polite but guarded. How can I help you? I just wanted to stop by and say thank you, Carol said, her words deliberate and sincere. For your patience, for your strength, and for giving me the chance to reflect on myself. Maya blinked, clearly caught off guard. You're welcome, she said after a moment, her voice steady despite her surprise. I'm glad to hear that. Carol hesitated, then added, I also wanted to let you know that I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About how respect is something you show, not just something you say. It's a lesson I needed to learn, and I'm trying to do better. Maya studied Carol for a moment, searching her face for signs of insincerity. But what she saw was a woman who was genuinely trying, however imperfectly, to make amends. Maya nodded, a small smile breaking through her composure. I appreciate that, she said. It means a lot. As Carol left the store, she felt a sense of relief she hadn't expected. The conversation with Maya hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. For the first time in years, she felt like she was moving in the right direction, however slowly. That evening, Carol decided to share her experience with Ryan. As they sat in the living room, the soft glow of the TV casting shadows on the walls, she told him about her visit to the grocery store. I talked to Maya again, she said, her voice quiet but steady. And I apologized, properly this time. Ryan looked at her, his expression unreadable. And, he prompted. And, she accepted it, Carol said. I don't know if she'll ever fully forgive me, but I wanted her to know that I'm trying. Ryan nodded slowly, his gaze softening. That's a good start, Mom, he said. But remember, it's not just about one apology. It's about the choices you make every day. I know, Carol said. And I'm ready to make those choices. For the first time in weeks, Ryan smiled, a small, tentative smile, but one that gave Carol a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could start to rebuild their relationship, one step at a time. Across town, Maya sat at her kitchen table, the bouquet of flowers still sitting in its vase. She thought about her conversation with Carol, about the sincerity in her voice and the vulnerability in her eyes. For so long, Maya had learned to expect the worst from people like Carol. But today, she had seen something different. She had seen the possibility of change. As the evening wore on, Maya found herself thinking about her own life, about the challenges she had faced and the strength she had found in herself. She realized that, in standing up to Carol, even in the quiet, dignified way she had reclaimed a piece of her own power. And that was something no one could take away from her. That night, as she got ready for bed, Maya felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in days. She didn't know what the future held for Carol, for Ryan, or even for herself. But she knew one thing for certain: she had faced adversity with grace, and she had come out stronger for it. And in that strength, she found hope, not just for herself, but for the world around her. Seeds of change. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to the lives of everyone involved in that pivotal day at the grocery store. What had begun as a painful confrontation had blossomed into an opportunity for growth and transformation, not just for Carol Higgins and Maya Brooks, but for those who had witnessed the events and even the community around them. Carol's transformation. Carol had always seen herself as a strong-willed woman, someone who didn't take nonsense from anyone. But the incident with Maya had exposed the difference between being strong and being unkind. For the first time, she was forced to confront the hard truth about herself, the assumptions she carried, and the ways her actions impacted others. She didn't just stop at apologizing to Maya. Carol made a commitment to learn and unlearn. She began reading books and articles about empathy, bias, and the importance of treating service workers with dignity. The concepts weren't always easy to digest, some of them made her uncomfortable, but that discomfort became her catalyst for change. One Saturday afternoon, Carol volunteered to assist at a local community center, a place she had previously driven past without a second thought. She helped organize a food drive, working alongside people from all walks of life. It was humbling work, but it opened her eyes to the resilience and kindness of people she might have otherwise overlooked. Her biggest breakthrough, however, came at home. Ryan, who had been keeping a quiet distance, began to notice his mother's efforts. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Carol hesitated before speaking. "Ryan," she began, her voice hesitant, "I just wanted to thank you." Ryan looked up from his plate, surprised. "For what?" "For standing up to me that day," Carol said. "You could have stayed quiet, but you didn't. You made me see myself in a way I hadn't before, and I'm better for it." Ryan's expression softened, and a small smile tugged at his lips. "You're trying, Mom," he said simply. "That's all I wanted to see." In that moment, Carol realized that change wasn't about grand gestures, it was about the small, consistent choices that defined who she was becoming. Maya's strength. For Maya, life had returned to its usual rhythm at the grocery store, but she carried herself with a renewed sense of confidence. The incident with Carol had been draining, but it had also reminded her of her own strength. She had faced humiliation and overcome it with grace, and that resilience became a source of quiet pride. Her co-workers noticed the change. Evelyn, the older cashier who had always been a source of encouragement, took Maya aside one day during their break. "You've got something special, Maya," Evelyn said, her tone warm. "The way you handled yourself that day, and the way you carry yourself now, it's inspiring." Maya smiled, though her cheeks flushed slightly. "I just did what I thought was right." "And that's exactly why you're going places," Evelyn replied. "Don't ever forget that." Encouraged by Evelyn's words and her own experiences, Maya began to dream bigger. She had always planned to go to college, but now she was considering studying something that would allow her to help others, perhaps social work or community leadership. She wanted to use her experiences to make a difference, to be a voice for those who might feel silenced or overlooked, just as she had once been. One evening, while scrolling through her phone, Maya came across a scholarship opportunity offered by a local nonprofit that supported young people pursuing higher education. The application required an essay about overcoming challenges and showing resilience. Maya hesitated at first, doubting whether her story was worth sharing. But as she thought about everything she had endured and the lessons she had learned, she realized her story could be a powerful testament to her strength and determination. She spent hours crafting her essay, pouring her heart into every word. In it, she described the day at the grocery store, not as a story of hardship, but as a moment that had shaped her character. She wrote about the power of kindness, the importance of standing up for oneself, and the courage it took to face adversity with dignity. When she finally submitted the application, she felt a wave of nervousness but also a sense of accomplishment. Whatever the outcome, she was proud of herself for taking a step toward her future. Eric's role. Eric, the man who had stepped in to defend Maya, found himself reflecting on the events at the grocery store as well. He hadn't planned to intervene that day, but something about Carol's behavior had struck a nerve. It reminded him of moments in his own life when he had been treated unfairly and had wished for someone to stand by his side. Since that day, Eric couldn't stop thinking about how small acts of courage could make a big difference. He started looking for more opportunities to speak up, whether it was mentoring younger colleagues at work or volunteering with a local advocacy group. He even reached out to the manager of the grocery store to suggest a Customer Appreciation Day as a way to foster positivity and respect between staff and shoppers. The idea was well received, and within weeks, the store hosted its first-ever appreciation event. Maya and her co-workers were celebrated for their hard work, and customers were encouraged to leave notes of gratitude for the staff. Eric attended the event and made a point to thank Maya personally for her strength. "You inspired me, he told her. "The way you handled yourself that day, it reminded me that we all have a responsibility to stand up for what's right." Maya smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you for standing up for me," she said. "It meant more than you know." A community awakens. The incident at the grocery store didn't just change the lives of those directly involved, it also sparked a shift within the community. Word of what had happened spread, and it became a topic of conversation among neighbors, co-workers, and even local businesses. The grocery store's management took the opportunity to implement diversity and sensitivity training for all employees and encouraged open dialogue about how to create a more inclusive environment. Customers who had witnessed the confrontation began to reevaluate their own behaviors, recognizing the importance of treating everyone with respect. Even Carol, who had once been a source of negativity, found herself becoming a quieter, kinder presence in the community. She started greeting store employees by name, offering small compliments, and going out of her way to express gratitude. It was a slow process, but one that didn't go unnoticed. One day, as Carol walked into the grocery store, Maya was at her register. Their eyes met, and Carol offered a small, tentative smile. Maya returned it, and though no words were exchanged, the gesture spoke volumes. A new beginning. Months later, Maya received an email that made her heart race. It was from the nonprofit offering the scholarship. With trembling hands, she opened the message and read the first line. "Congratulations. You have been selected as one of our scholarship recipients." Tears welled in her eyes as she read the rest of the email, which praised her essay for its authenticity and resilience. She couldn't wait to tell her mother, Evelyn, and even Eric, all of whom had supported her in ways big and small. As Maya prepared to embark on this new chapter of her life, she felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the scholarship, but for the journey that had brought her here. What had started as a moment of pain and humiliation had become a turning point, not only for her but for everyone involved. The ripple continues. In the end, the confrontation at the grocery store became more than just an isolated incident. It was a reminder that even the smallest interactions have the power to shape lives, for better or worse. It showed that change begins with accountability, empathy, and the courage to do better. For Maya, Carol, Ryan, and Eric, the lessons of that day would stay with them, guiding their actions and shaping their futures. Maya would go on to college, using her experiences to advocate for others and build a career grounded in compassion and leadership. Carol, once a woman hardened by entitlement and bias, became a quieter, more introspective version of herself. She volunteered regularly, made efforts to connect with people she once dismissed, and began to rebuild her relationship with Ryan, who had grown to admire the steps she was taking to be better. Ryan, inspired by his mother's willingness to change, became a staunch advocate for kindness and inclusion in his own life. He carried forward the lessons of that day, standing up for others whenever he saw an opportunity and encouraging those around him to do the same. And Eric, the man who had spoken up when Maya needed it most, continued to use his voice to champion fairness and respect. His actions that day had reminded him of the importance of speaking out, and he remained committed to making a difference in his community. The ripples of that single, powerful moment at the grocery store extended far beyond its walls, touching lives in ways no one could have anticipated. It was a testament to the power of courage, humility, and the belief that even the smallest acts of kindness can create a lasting impact. And for Maya, it was a reminder that strength isn't just about enduring adversity, it's about rising above it and inspiring others to do the same.